All welcome. Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so fine. Once again, good evening, everyone. You're all welcome to day 2 of our November to Remember series. And today, we're excited to have Professor Dr. Paul. He will be the one leading us in the research, and he will give us insights on the funding and collaboration. So Mr. Paul is one of our professors here, and behind his biodata, he's the one responsible for supporting collaborating research activities across the University of Bolton. So he's an experienced academic, and he has published some of the activities across the diverse range subjects in arts, education, business, and technology. So we're very happy to have him because he'll be the one engaging us in this topic for today. So my profs, you are welcome, and the floor is open for us to have your insights, sir.
Thank you. Are we ready to go? Celestine, can you give me a thumbs up if you can see my screen? That's brilliant. Welcome. Now, I'm going to veer off a little bit from what perhaps you're expecting here, as the November to Remember is about technology and transformation. And so what I'm going to do today, I will talk about REF, which is part of my role, in a very, very small way. I'll talk about collaboration and how collaboration kind of works on what is a very large project. But I also want to talk about technology transformation. And I'm going to talk about a project that we're managing, that we're involved in at the University of Bolton, that we're midway through. We're 2 years, coming up to 2 years left on this project. And I think it's been quite a moment for me. And I've had certainly time to think philosophically about technology and how it changes the world, which I think is very much in line with the themes that Celestine wanted to explore with this series of events. So I think to start with, I'll talk a little bit about collaboration. Projects don't just happen. There's a lot of work involved, and I think it's probably about 2.5 years since I kind of first conceived the whole idea of this project. Now, this book here was written some time ago. Some of you may be familiar with the book. It's called Reality is Broken. It was written by Jane McGonigal. Now, much of what Jane writes about at the time in 2030, and I was involved in games research, was for me a little ambitious, very American, and a little hyperbole. But I think something that has occurred in the project I'm working on at the moment that said, well, actually, there is something here. And what Jane wrote about was why games make us better and how they can change the world. Now, it sounds a bit hyperbolic. It sounds a very grandiose statement. But actually, I think there is potential for games to change the world. And that is something that we're going to explore in the project that I'm going to talk about. But the germ of idea was a conversation between myself and an academic at UNIR in Spain. And it was talking about games, it was talking about technology, it was talking about all of those things in the context of a European call. Now, anyone who's ever been involved in European funding will know that they are very complex calls. They require an awful lot of work and certainly a considerable amount of collaboration. And so our first idea was, well, how do we realize this concept, this germ of an idea, as I describe it there, into something that is fundable in terms of a research project. So those of you who will have seen my lectures about research funding, I have a bit of a mantra, and I usually get people to join in when I say to them at every other juncture in preparing a bid, read the call. And we read the call, we read the call again, we read it again, we read it again, and we got somebody else to read it. And within the Horizon funding program, there was a concept around games and culture, and the idea seemed to fit very well. So there were several meetings over about 8 months where writing, collaborative writing worked, and I got together a team of people that I'd worked with before in projects, in European projects, and some that I hadn't, that we thought could add value and perhaps a diverse perspective. Now, there are a couple of faces on there that might be familiar. I'm there. There's a Professor Di Griffiths who used to work at the University of Bolton, and there's Celestine in a similar red T-shirt to the one that he's wearing tonight. It isn't the same one, so I'm quite glad that we didn't catch him out there. Colleagues from UNIR and from other universities across Europe. So we came up with a concept. Well, how do we realize this ambition, and how do we build an evidence base? How do we examine and explore as to how games technologies can influence the world? And one area that we thought of was climate change, which affects all of us. And there is now a body of work. Climate change is a thing that we all need to deal with. And would games provide a way of engaging people in broader discussions around climate change, around how it impacts on us, and how could we think about climate change policy, and could games be used to affect and affect climate change policy at a national level? Very, very ambitious. And when we were talking about it, I had my own doubts as to whether we could do this, but as we worked and as we progressed, we came up with collaboratively a concept that we thought could work in the context of the European Union funding. So the project GREAT was born. It's part of the research and innovation on cultural heritage funding in the European Union. And it is games realizing effective and affective transformation in societal and cultural domains. We were funded by the European Union. A bit of a side issue here, that at the time, the UK was not signed up to the Horizon programme. And so we had a little bit of added complexity in that the funding for the UK partners would come from UK research and innovation. And that added a whole tier of complexity and required a lot of discussion and navigation with the Commission and the UKRI. And I think I could probably give an hour's lecture on that particular experience, but we got there. One of the things that has resulted in that is that we have dual reporting, both to the Commission at the project level and to UKRI in terms of our financial reporting, which requires us to send in detailed claims every 3 months rather than a year, and has proved challenging in terms of the project. Now, what are we going to do with the GREAT project? And well, our goals and objectives are, we're going to find out how games can be designed to provide a link between citizens and policymakers, but it's a little bit further than that, because we want to think and we want to certainly deploy the potential of existing games to engage players in policy change and discussion around this. So whilst we can do a fairly small scale intervention with individual games, we needed to do something much bigger. I'll talk about that later. Understand the impact that games can have on citizens' engagement in social issues and on policy stakeholder awareness of what we think as citizens, what our attitudes are, and how they might vary. Now, we had ambitions that we would engage internationally with this, so that we weren't restricting our citizens' surveys, our responses, in any kind of geopolitical boundary, and that includes the EU. We wanted to go much wider to try do something internationally and do something globally. So we also wanted to provide practical guidance for games developers and stakeholders at what this ecosystem, if I can call it that, looks like, what and how people and organizations may engage with this ecosystem, and give developers guidance as to what this ecosystem may look like. And we needed, in terms of our research, to examine and look at the benefits and the risks to individuals and societies in using games to promote this engagement with societal challenges. There are risks to all our technical interventions. The relationship between humans and technology is something that has interested me for most of my professional career. So it was important that we think about not just the ethics of this, but the complexity of these relationships that might occur between player, technology, and government and stakeholders in the whole process. So what is the project? Well, it was about using technologies and methodologies to create, in effect, a new communication channel between citizens and policymakers, and to generate actionable insights. And again, I go back to, whilst respecting data privacy and any ethical concerns around the whole space. So we do that through co-designing scalable interventions, and we test those in real-world conditions, and to engage audiences that have historically been more difficult to reach. Now, I don't want to make any gross generalizations about digital natives or digital immigrants or Generation Z, though I do refer to Generation Z a little later in the presentation. But it is important that we, particularly in politics, engage younger people. Now, what we have found, and I'll preempt some of the findings, is that our younger generations, and that includes, I think, everybody here, because I think everybody is pretty much younger than me, are very, very concerned about climate change. And so it wasn't difficult to engage them in the subject. Authentic input, interaction, and collaboration are crucial, and games give us continuous feedback, and they are optimum in terms of the way they engage the player. Players, when playing in a state of flow, and that was something we were keen not to interrupt, and I'll touch on that a little bit with one of the interventions. We also used a citizen science approach for varying degrees of participation, from consultation to empowerment. So in the small scale interventions we have used citizen science to co-design the games and the learning activities around climate change. I'll talk about, there are two very distinct approaches within the GREAT project, and they are quite different, and in terms of data produce very different results. And I'll talk about that a little later. And it was our ambition. At that time, we didn't know we'd achieve it or realize the ambition to engage both global and national stakeholders. So one of our key identified global organizations was the United Nations, and specifically the development program, pan-European, national governmental authorities or non-governmental authorities, ministries, all who were interested in climate action. The collaboration, well, as you can see, the whole project has involved a number of different partners. I've listed them all there. UNIR, which is the University of Rioja in Spain. Planet Play, who are a commercial organization that have worked very, very closely in these spaces for some time. DIPF, who are our German institute, who are our coordinators of this project. Frederick University, who are based in Cyprus. ZSI, who provide specialist evaluation and social science expertise. The University of Bolton, and we are critical to the project in many aspects. SGI, Serious Games International, who provide the dilemma-based learning approach, which I'll talk about a little later. NWU, who are one of our associate partners based in South Africa. Really important to bring in associates, and they've engaged so well with the project. Our associates provide a different perspective, and particularly and specifically being outside the UK, and NWU have been a great, excuse the pun, partner in the project. And we also engage with the Beijing Normal University. But those of you who have perhaps worked with Chinese universities understand the difficulties perhaps in working with China from a technical perspective in terms of the internet, access to it, and information. And we've been no different in the great project. That's been one of our challenges. So little bit about what we were doing in terms of our vision. Planet Play had done work with the UN before around climate change, and reached a very large percentage of the population, indeed half the population, with a previous survey conducted around climate change. And that was called the People's Climate Vote in 2021. Little bit of it there. It was accessed via mobile games. It used paid for advertising to engage players, particularly Google ads and Instagram ads and the kind. And some of the findings there were that 64% of the world's population believe climate change is an emergency. And that's a bit of a wake-up call for policymakers. And the UN wanted to further expand on that. And a little bit of a quote from my colleague, Jude Auer, who is the Chief Engagement Officer at Planet Play. Games give us a global platform to engage, to drive action, evidence progress, and all supported by hard data. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that later. And we use various surveys and quiz games to try and obtain large amounts of, in the Planet Play aspect of the work, quantitative data at, I'll say, a global level. And we've certainly achieved that. There are two approaches to this. And what we wanted to do was work at a local level and a global level. And our approaches are quite different, and intentionally so. I have to say it's been quite difficult with the Commission to enlighten the reviewers in terms of these distinctions, who have a tendency to kind of fall into a gamification style discussion, which is not something that I'm going to talk about much in this presentation. But in terms of the Planet Play approach, we're looking at short quiz games embedded within existing commercial games. and we wanted to reach up to 3 million players. We've kind of done that already, and I'll talk about that later. It's quantitative data, and it's very quick and very easy for players to engage in the process. The second is a dilemma game, and that's a much longer. We're hoping to reach smaller groups, maximum of a few hundred, but a richer data set in terms of qualitative data. And we're looking at co-designing these activities with our players. So two quite different approaches, but we think quite complementary. When you do a European project, and this is something here about project management, there is a whole series of administration behind it. And as you can see there, our work packages include management, intervention design, technology, case studies, evaluation, dissemination. Now, today, I'm going to talk a bit about management because that's about the way we collaborate and the way we work, and a lot more about the doing, the work package 4, which are the case studies. And as you can see, there are a whole lot of what the EU devise in their terminology as deliverables. These are things we produce to let various stakeholders and the public know that we're on track with the work that we're doing. So you can see them there. I'm not going to spend a great deal of time on each of those. They're quite happy to take questions later. So up until September, these are the deliverables that the project produced. Quality handbooks, research data management plan, and these are all collaborative documents that we need to work as a team together to produce. And we have a quality process by which these are assessed and reviewed and submitted, and they're all listed there. Some of those are quite administrative, quite prosaic kind of documents. Some of them, but I would say this because the lead beneficiary in terms of the research framework and the case study is the University of Bolton. We devised the methodology supported by our partners. So we're at the core of this project. All of them were submitted on time. First time, and not the first time actually, but we have had a couple of the deliverables returned that require further work. And that's interesting because when that happens, you have to ensure that you've got a good team ethic, that you collaborate and work well and support the lead of the work packages that have had these returned. I will report that none of Bolton's have been returned, so I'm quite pleased about that. But I'm quite involved in supporting other colleagues in working on a couple of the deliverables that need a bit more support. Project website, this is the kind of thing that it's a screenshot of the EU portal. So the tick boxes are all there. We've done everything. Everything would have been submitted when it should have been. And there is a reference in the corner there about our documents being publicly available. I'll talk about that a little bit more later. So, as I said, today's focus is on two aspects of the work pack of the great project or work package activity. So I'm going to focus on work package 1, which, if I'm honest, is probably the least exciting part of the research, but very important in terms of how you put the structures in place to collaborate with your partners in delivering what is a very large project. And then work package 4. Now, work package 4 is where the really exciting things happen. The games, what we're doing, and I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the results. And this is the first occasion that I'm going to publicly talk about, I guess, the scale of the work we're doing with some hard data. So project management, there are lots of smiley faces there. That is a consortium meeting. So the coordinator in the European project communicates and is responsible for talking to the PO is the project officer in Europe. makes sure that the decisions are made when they should be. We have regular meetings, which I'll talk about, monitors and puts the quality processes in place for the deliverables and your financial reporting procedures. They're also responsible for internal communication. So we operate a wiki, we have Google Docs and Nextcloud for larger file storage, and we also have the repository for the outputs. But again, this kind of thing is critical to ensure that collaboration is supported and occurs in the project. As we said, we use Google Docs for minutes, collaborative working, and important links that work within the project as we progress. There are one or two of them highlighted there. It's for management to micro level, manage the work that we're doing as we're doing it. But because it's such a fast-paced project, we've got to be very, very much on the ball with this. You have to work with people that you trust. And there's a lot of trust involved in the various work packages because there are so many interdependencies with those work packages that will ensure that the project moves at the pace that it should. And again, little bit more there about our wiki, our communication, and how we work. And our various documents are stored over those three platforms that I talked about. So now our consortium meetings, well, there's a whole group of meetings that are required to ensure the collaboration occurs. Where I've seen collaboration fail in large research projects is where communication is poor. It sounds fairly obvious, but I've been in projects where so much of the communication has been not managed and not supported properly. And most problems tend to occur when one partner doesn't understand what the other's done, or there is a belief that they haven't done what they should have done when they should have done it. And so the whole series of meetings are put in place to ensure that we do achieve what we're supposed to achieve. So those as examples of consortium meetings are listed there. We have a bi-weekly meeting every 2 weeks where we discuss the whole project. We go through every single work package where we talk about progress, any challenges we might face, and any help we might need. And it's critical that we have those meetings. We also established a scientific committee to ensure that the project achieves its scientific objectives, and I'll talk about that later. So that is the research that we've scheduled. Are we dealing with the research questions properly? How do we deal with publications? How do we deal with the various scientific outputs? And those are all managed in the scientific committee. Every other week, we have a case study meeting where we discuss the progress on each of the individual case studies that are part of the project. And we have a working group that meets fortnightly to do that. And then individual work packages meet as and when required. And again, all those shiny, happy faces. And Celestine's got another red shirt on. It's a consistent theme, I think, in the great project. That's just a list of all of the weekly meetings that we had, right up to the review that we had with the European Union, which occurred on the 18th of September. So you can see they're all documented. Now, I think we'll go on to the really meaty bit. So the big part of this project, we had to think about how we address the research. We used a multidisciplinary approach, and we developed this case cycle. So as you can see, we have 8 stages in each of the case studies. That stage, or this particular structured approach, allow us to ensure that we deal with the major research questions in the project. And I'd recommend that a research cycle be something you think about when you start thinking about replicating research over multiple case studies. Part one of the cycle is prioritize the research. So what are the dilemmas? What are we going to ask? What are the kind of insights we need? What is the kind of evidence? And engage with your stakeholders in developing that. Stage two of the cycle is where we collaborate in the study design. So that is at the individual game level with the dilemma games, and more conceptually with our interventions in the much larger studies. Collaborate in the game design is stage three, and our approaches. And then we move to a piloting, a testing kind of phase where we gather the data, which will give us the evidence we need for the project. Then we do our interpretation of that data, our analysis of that data against a set of criteria that are framed within our research questions. Then we draw conclusions and outputs from that analysis, and then we disseminate it is what we do. And then, which is quite unique to the GREAT project, is that our advocacy. One of the things that is at the core of the project is our ability to affect change at the policy level. That's really difficult to do, and if I'm being honest, is a very challenging part of the project. So our key collaborations, again on that collaborative theme, have been with the United Nations Development Programme on our first case study, which is exploratory, and the Play to Act study, which I'll talk about later. We collaborated with a whole series of Austrian schools around climate change, and I'll talk about that within our Green Jobs case study. And then we've collaborated with formal government agencies and a non-government organisation called Urban Gorillas. We talk about green roofs, and that's in Cyprus. We also have worked at the UK with policy stakeholders, the national water companies, to try and address water shortages through a Waterwise case study, which I'll talk about. And it's listed there, our South African partner, NWU, with a project or a case study called Prosper. I'm not going to cover that today because I'm limited by time. UNDP, our first case study, we worked really with a small exploratory study. So this was, we received 4,000 responses. We worked through the game or embedded the game and the survey within the Smite game, which has an established gaming community. One of the things that we found with Smite, which we've addressed in subsequent studies, is that our gender mix wasn't perhaps how it should be. We were looking to certainly reflect the gender mix of general gameplay in global terms, which is now running at about 50-50 male and female, though we do accept that and we incorporate those that wouldn't identify as either gender or didn't wish to identify, but we needed to get a much better mix than we had in that. So in that first case study, we were able to think about our engagement process. We tested our technical platforms, our data formats, and we also thought about our methods of deployment. So whereas, as I said, previous studies had in effect bought advertising from Google, we were embedding within the games. Now, it was certainly financially more effective to do that, but in terms of time commitment, it was huge. And what it involved is developing relationships with game studios individually, and all that involved agreements with those case studies, particularly from a legal perspective. We also needed to think about our data standards and our protocols, particularly as that we had a requirement to publish open data in the project, and we want to make our data sets available for others to use, which has been quite interesting because it's raised a couple of questions I'll talk about later. And we needed to address our research questions. We've done some of that. I'll talk about how we represent that later. And we wanted to look at new deployment models which informed business models in this space. I'm not going to dwell on these, but you can see this is the kind of data that we were generating. So questions: what should the world do about climate change? Everything necessary, act slowly, do nothing. Unsurprisingly, the majority of responses in the small set was do everything urgently. But it's interesting that we were able to generate some preliminary findings from this fairly small data study. So that's what it served to do. We tested things. We again, more questions there. How do we protect people from storms and flooding? And you can see the data. I'm not going to dwell on the data analysis in this presentation because it's how this whole project has worked together and how collaboration works. So again, more data there you can see from some of our questions. And in later case studies, obviously these are expanded and the numbers are much more significant. Our second case study was on in Waterwise, and what that involved is looking at a co-creation process, and we wanted players to think about water management. Now, we're in the early stages of this, and so what we're looking to do with the water companies, they were very, very keen to think about how aware users were of the consumption of water. And in the UK, where it isn't a priority as perhaps it should be, and indeed it is in other countries and other continents where water is more sparse, the water companies were looking to ensure that citizens became more aware of their use and their impact on climate. Now, we used, in fact, there are two parts. We would, in this project, we would look at a smaller scale dilemma-based game, and you can see there. So we have surveys, discussions, water behavior surveys, where we will drill down eventually, it's work in progress, to a series of questions that are provided by the insights that the communities give us. Those questions will then be exposed to a much, much larger audience through our main embedding within games, within digital games, in the Planet Play kind of survey. So this involves the small scale survey and then a much larger one. I think our next project was a dilemma-based game, looking at using games again in a co-creative way to get insights into a particular problem in Cyprus. And that problem in Cyprus is that most of the roofs are concrete. Roofs occupy a very large amount of space on Cypriot territory. And so the government are looking at the impact and citizens' views on greening their roofs. So we've been working with them in developing a dilemma-based game to explore green roofs and the impact. So it's built on current pilot actions where the Cypriot authorities are looking at encouraging green roofs. It'll use all of the case study cycles. So all of those 8 cycles that I spoke about earlier, we're going to be looking at those. And it provides recommendations for future games, dilemma games, and it gives us a contribution to our great questions, which again, I'll talk about later. And it'll provide, we believe, a much more informed process to more traditional consultation. And again, it's about connecting the policy initiative with different members of the public. And how can Nicosia become more sustainable? How can we promote a new layer to the city by using roofs for greening that involves social cohesion. Some interesting diagrams there in terms of the impact of green roofs that you can see on a heat map, and what incentives or strategies would encourage citizens to start thinking about green roofs. This is a little flow diagram of the activity that we occurred. We used Miro boards, we spec'd a whole variety of questions to provide detail and input into the case study, which is now near completion. And so what was the reflection on that work that we did? Well, the great methodology employed in Rooftops Reimagined brings together new voices that would not usually engage in urban planning. Stakeholders face challenging engaging with each other due to hierarchies, and games can, we think, break down some of those hierarchies, which is an interesting development. Expert feedback, bringing the games to address the big issues like climate change, proved quite effective. And there's a whole series of policy recommendations in Cyprus, which you can see are listed there. I'm rolling through quite quickly because I'm very conscious of time, and I want to try and finish so that we can take a couple of questions. Another case study using dilemma games-based learning was Green Jobs. We worked with 10 different schools in Austria, mainly with 15+ students, predominantly female in this case, 3 rural areas and in Vienna. And this was done April to June 2024. And we wanted to encourage green jobs as a future or something that citizens might wish to consider. And again, our main findings that motivational factors for young people in their career choice, money, work-life balance, personal interests, measures to motivate them, insights, the realities of jobs via internships, workshops, presentations, and measures to achieve a greater gender balance in green jobs, which are predominantly male at this stage. We target specific groups. We look at gender neutral education within schools, and we look to try and achieve gender equality in the workplace. So green jobs, again, a small scale study. Now, I think now I'm going to talk about a case study 5, which is our play to act. And now, this is a very, very large study. And certainly as this has progressed, it's allowed me to think and achieve some of those very ambitious objectives I talked to you about earlier. The study is called Play to Act, and it is with the United Nations Development Programme. Well, why? Well, we wanted, or certainly the UN had an ambition to democratize climate change. The ambition was to reach 1 billion people. Now that is huge. There's never been anything that has reached those kind of numbers. And I'm going to show you something later that'll see where we've got to in terms of that ambition. And we want within the study to get leaders to take bigger and bolder action, if indeed that's what our citizens are telling us that is required. Now, we know that gamers care about it. Study in 2022 said that all of them wanted to, or certainly 81% of those in that initial study I talked about were very keen that action was taken. Gamers care about this. And we know that the games industry is beginning to take climate change seriously. There was a huge Playing for the Planet initiative, which again, I'm not going to talk about here today. And we know that politicians struggle to reach the hard to reach. Now, it's got Generation Z there. I apologize in advance for the generalization, but when we're talking about the games industry, we need to communicate in a language that the games industry are comfortable with, and that is a generational grouping that is widely used within the games industry. Over 80% of them play games, so obviously it's huge. I mentioned to you earlier that we needed to partner with game studios, and as you can see there, I won't run through them all, but we're partnering with some of the largest game studios in the world. We've actually got agreements with 28 studios, and there'll be familiar names there in terms of the games. Those who play games would know Cybo are the developers of the Subway Surfers game, which is the largest online game in the world. And indeed, we're partnering with them for a presentation in 2 weeks' time at the Web Summit in Lisbon. So we've got traction with the games industry. They're really interested in working with us. So with the UNDP study, Play to Act study, we're adapting and document. We're rolling out individual studies every 6 months. And we're looking at a long-term, a longitudinal view in terms of outcomes, impact in the policy-making process. And the study will help us develop our business models with working with industry. That's something we're doing now with all 28 organizations that have engaged with us in looking at what this ecosystem may look like in the future as it engages. We're looking at technology advancement consistent with the theme of the lecture that Celestine has put together for November to Remember. This is a clear demonstration of how technology is going to impact on the world. We will look at using AI perhaps in future studies, and we've moved from a very simple basic model of buying space to working much closer with the studios. Now, our findings. Well, there's a big question mark there. Now, the reason the question mark is there is that we've got some quite significant findings. I am going to touch on it very briefly at the end. These are not published, they're work in progress. And so at the moment, I can't tell you until we publish these things exactly what we are, but I'm going to give you some very, very brief insights into what I think are astounding responses to the work we've done. Before I do that, I'm going to move back to something a little more prosaic, but I talked about the research questions of the project and what we've done here. You can see these research questions in terms of what we're trying to do in this project and the case studies that I've talked about here that respond to those questions and provide us data. So the focus of the research in GREAT is on the efficacy of the technology. It is not necessarily on the climate change questions themselves, or at least it wasn't when we started. However, or certainly the project has caused me to think very, very seriously about certainly the philosophical aspects of games in society. But those are our research questions. Which game-based activities can be used to represent and communicate with citizens? How effective are games-based activities in eliciting these kind of responses? How efficient is the use of games-based activity in eliciting responses? And I've noticed Celestine's looking at his watch, so I've got to be a little quicker and I'll run through them. But all of the research questions are there. Our outputs and impacts, before I give you the snippets on the findings, are all available by that link, which will be available when the slides are produced. But insofar as we've already produced 32 outputs, 10 published papers, 3 in development, there are actually 5, 13 reports, academic posters, newsletters, we've already got an open data set. Now, we have an additional set complete. Now, why we're not publishing that is that it is such a large survey. The data set is so large that we have to use that data set to publish findings in various different domains. Computer scientists in Celestine's CEOth are looking at from a computer science perspective. We're looking at it from psychology. We'll also be looking at it from game studies. And this is a huge data set. So it will be published. It'll probably be published towards the end of 2025, but we're working on it now. In terms of our academic outputs, we've had about, well over 1,600 downloads of the various outputs and papers, and 2,500 views of those papers. Right. Now, before I kind of finish, you're kind of saying, well, he's talked about these big numbers. He's talked about these figures. Where are they? Well, I'm going to give you a little preview of the Great Case Study 5 UNDP data set. Now, this is an interactive map. And as you can see, with this data set, we reached every single country in the world. And we had completed surveys from every single country in the world with 2 exceptions. One was North Korea, which I think those understand perhaps the limitations on internet use and communication in that country would go some way to explaining that. The other was Eritrea in Africa. We're still kind of thinking, we think that's something to do with poor communication, even communication telephony in that single country in Africa. Africa quite broadly has contributed to the project. Now, as you can see, United States, 108,000 sessions, 34,000 engagements, 30,000 responses, and 25,866 completed surveys. Now, this is huge. I can go to Russia. A lot of people thought we wouldn't reach Russia. Well, again, 30,000 individual sessions. We've had 7,000 completed survey responses to the various questions we've had on climate change. The UK, you would expect, is fairly high. Brazil, I can scroll over each of these countries and we have the data from each of the sessions and the responses. And if I tell you that thus far we've had over 120,000 completed responses, our engagement has been significant. It is starting to reach the kind of numbers globally. I mean, if you look at Greenland, we've even had 2 completions from Greenland. I don't know how many people live in Greenland. We say the population of 56,000, but we've had some engagement. So this is beginning to certainly make me think about this is so significant. I'm bold enough to say this will be the largest ever global survey on climate change. And we'll have that data and we're working on it. So that gives you some idea of where we are. But I think it's important that we think about this, and I want to give you some initial reflections. What does this all mean? We've definitely identified something in terms of the global reach of this technology. And I'm going to be bold enough to say that games have the potential to cross all geopolitical boundaries. Now, that is a huge statement to make. When Berners-Lee was thinking about the internet in the 90s, the ideal of the internet was to break these geopolitical boundaries to allow citizens to communicate broadly. Didn't quite achieve that for all sorts of different reasons. Well, games might actually allow us to have these conversations across these cross-cultural and geopolitical boundaries. And certainly the response that we've had to the survey and the reach that we've had, every country bar 2 in the world seems to suggest that this is within our reach. We know that it has, and digital games have massive global reach. We know that gamers care about climate change, and we think that the potential of borderless communication could be achieved. We're pretty confident that Great could produce the largest ever global survey of views on climate change. But what it does mean is we've got a lot of work to do in 2025 and in 2026 in reaching that. Now, I'm going to thank you for your time. I wanted to talk a bit about what a big research project looks like and how it works. Now, I think this is a really exciting opportunity for the University of Bolton. We've got some enormous data sets that we're going to be working through. We're midway through the project. We've had our pain points. I'd welcome anybody, and the slides will be made available, that wants to know more about the project. I'm happy to talk to them, and that's the project website. And on that note, Celestine, I think I'm on time. I've got a couple of minutes left. If you could, anyone wishes to ask any questions?
Okay, I must say hello.
Hello.
Yeah, I might say a very big thank you to you, sir, on these great insights on strategies for funding and collaboration. So the floor will be open for questions to our prof. If you have any question, so they can actually answer those questions for us.
Please feel free, don't be shy. Right. How was the survey distributed? Well, the survey was distributed. The whole project is about embedding the survey questions within gameplay. So the whole project is focused on, do games allow us to communicate with citizens globally, and are they effective in doing that? So the distribution is at the core of the project. They're distributed, embedded within, if we're talking about the Planet Play aspect of the work we're doing, within digital games. Got it. Thanks. If there are any other questions, don't be shy.
We still have any questions? Okay.
Yep. Oh, hi.
Hello.
Yeah. Hi. Oh, thank you so much. It was quite an insightful and informative research. I have a kind of a question that I needed to ask. You mentioned about research and funding opportunities. So I wish to know, do you have presently kind of opportunities for PhD students, or this research has a tendency of accommodating students with curiosity to do carry on like PhD research? Yeah, that's my question basically.
Okay. The project itself does not incorporate PhD opportunities. However, I think you ask a really pertinent question, and I think that's something I'll discuss with colleagues in games and within CEOth to see, and I'm sure that our team are looking to develop ongoing and further research in this space and using the data that we've got. And so it gives us opportunities perhaps to explore that. But at the moment, it isn't a PhD kind of activity, though if students' work or PhD research overlapped what we were looking at, and wanted to engage with us and the data we have, we'd be more than happy to do that. So that's an open invitation, and I'm quite happy, as I noticed that my colleague Rebecca is on this call, Celestine is on this call, to have that kind of conversation. I'm looking in the chat, and there's another questions. If I may ask, Prof, what is the larger picture in the end? Well, the larger picture in the end, I think, is the interesting one. I think I said in one of the slides, what does this really mean? And I think the larger picture in the end is that digital games do have the potential to reach globally in ways that no other communication method has. And I think that needs to be explored. And that is something that I think is a fundamental and philosophical change. Indeed, it pretty much aligns with the view expressed in McGonagall's work that I spoke about at the beginning, in terms of games and the potential of games to change the world. I think that's the big picture. What ethical concerns were identified, and how were they addressed? Well, there's a whole series of, I think, ethical challenges. There is one, the data. We needed to ensure that privacy was kept, so data was anonymized. So no individual players or individual email addresses were taken unless at the end of the survey, those that we engaged with wished to become part of the group. And we have had 27,000 responses. 27,000 people have opted to work with ourselves and Planet Play in future research. And that's when we may be able to explore further avenues. So it was really about privacy, about compliance with data requirements, about anonymity of data, and around ensuring that those that engaged with this activity were confident in engaging. In some countries, if I tell you that what surprised me is that we had a large number of completed surveys in Gaza. And when you think of the difficulties in Gaza at the moment with the conflict, that players took the time to engage with us, to conduct a survey, and are playing games when any communication with Gaza is very, very difficult, then that to me is indicative of the power of the medium, which is what we're essentially trying to explore. I'm going to look at some more. What methods have you used to reach out to all those places? Well, again, I go back to our method is embedding these activities within established games. And as I've said, games seem to cross geopolitical boundaries, where perhaps governments, for whatever reason, have closed down the internet or methods of communication where media is regulated. Games seem to allow us to have that exchange, and so present fantastic opportunities. We have a responsibility to respect those the affordances of games. And again, that's probably some work that I'd look at in the future, how we do that. Alicia, if I may ask, with the rapid growth in digital games, would the research also include, or rather cover, the Web3 AI environment? Because it seems Gen Z seems to be interested in all these aspects. And also I noticed the partnership with Ubisoft. Well, yes, Ubisoft are one of the development groups that have engaged with us. Now, whilst we're not specifically at this point dealing with AI, I am sure that my colleague Celestine and I we'll have a conversation about how we might expand these kind of activities using AI and Web3, the relationship with AI and Web3 to games. However, I think something about Web3 that interests me is very difficult to engage with China, for example. Now, with games, we somehow, well, I think I understand how, we've managed to engage with China in the Chinese community in a very meaningful way. And so whilst we need to think very, very carefully, there is potential to engage with these other technologies. I hope I've answered your question there. Yahia Ibrahim has said gotcha. So I think he understands how we've used games. Thanks.
Thanks, Prof. I must say it's very answerable to each of the questions, well explained. I believe most of them got their answers as expected.
Thank you.
Based on the floor, as I can see there's no more questions, I would like to invite Mr. Celestine to give vote of thanks and the awards to you, sir.
Thank you.
Can you see my slide?
Yes, I can.
Okay. You want to say thank you, Professor Paul, for coming. Our usual way of doing, we are presenting you a plug. It has been a very nice program, a nice talk. It's something that I've been part of, and we are still doing more. And want to thank everyone for also coming in today. Please share this slide, the announcement to everyone for the remaining, how many days now? 12 more days. So it's going to be intense. It's now increasing every time, So thank you so much, Professor Paul, for coming, accepting to speak in this program. And then we'll do quite a whole lot. Tomorrow is another time, 6 p.m. We'll try to keep it on time, just 1 hour. Tomorrow will be on the role of explainable AI in cybersecurity. Is massive. Professor Lani will be delivering that from he just moved from Canada to Qatar, to Dubai. So it's going to be very great again. Thank you very much, everyone,
and
for coming.
Celestine, I'd just like to thank you for the invitation, and I would like to thank the audience for the questions. And if you are interested in engaging more, don't hesitate to get in touch with any of the team. We'd be happy to talk to you and help you. And thank you so much for attending and putting up with an old man and his ramblings for about an hour.
Okay. Thank you, everyone, and have a good night. Thank you.
Thank you.
See you tomorrow. See you.
Bye.
Thank you, Prof. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Prof.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Prof. Thank you.
Thank you, Prof.